Hello, this is Lady Boulay, and welcome back to Black American Lineage. It is very important that we set ourselves apart from everybody else if we want to preserve our history. It is so easy to blend in with American history, and once we become a part of American history, it is so easy to change the race of a person, and then Black Americans have been whited out of the history, and white people are taking credit for our achievements. And then white people will arrogantly say to us, "You haven't made a contribution to civilization." So setting apart Black American lineage, history, and culture is very important. And the brilliant man that I'm going to talk about in this video came along at a time when Black people knew how to document their work. This is Dr. Vivien Thomas. He is the man that the TV movie Something the Lord Made was about. It starred the rapper Mos Def, and it won several awards. Dr. Thomas is known for developing a procedure to treat blue baby syndrome. Blue baby syndrome is a heart disease in babies, in infants, and it is caused by them not getting enough oxygen in their blood. So to come up with a cure for this disease, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say it mostly affected white babies. So to come up with a cure for this condition was extraordinary all by itself. But for a Black man who had no more training than a high school education to come up with a cure for this was really extraordinary. Vivien Thomas was born in New Providence, Louisiana. When he was 2 years old, his family moved to Nashville. His father was a carpenter, and he and his brothers worked with his father on carpentry jobs. In 1929, he graduated from high school. His goal was to go to college to be a doctor, but the stock market crashed and the depression hit, so he had to go to work. He had a friend that worked at Vanderbilt Hospital, and he asked the friend to help him get a job. His friend knew of an opening as a janitor, so he was hired as a janitor. But this Dr. Alfred Blalock needed an assistant in his lab because he was so hard to get along with that nobody wanted to work with him. So Vivian got a job in the lab. And the first day he got there, the doctor was operating on a dog, and he had to assist in the operation. Vivian was very curious and paid attention to everything the doctor did. And in a few weeks, he was operating on dogs by himself. Vivien Thomas and Dr. Blalock did groundworking research into the causes of hemorrhagic and traumatic shock. So I guess that hemorrhagic means excessive bleeding and shock. Their work later evolved into research on crush syndrome. And this research saved the lives of thousands of soldiers on the battlefield in World War II. In hundreds of experiments, the two disproved traditional theories which held that shock was caused by toxins in the blood. Blalock, a highly original scientific thinker and something of an iconoclast, had theorized that shock resulted from fluid loss outside the vascular bed, and that the condition could be effectively treated by fluid replacement. Assisted by Thomas, he was able to provide incontrovertible proof of this theory, and in so doing, he gained wide recognition in the medical community by the mid-1930s. At the same time, Blalock and Thomas began experimental work in vascular and cardiac surgery, defying medical taboos against operating upon the heart. It was this work that laid the foundation for the revolutionary life-saving surgery they were to perform at Johns Hopkins a decade later. Vivien Thomas spent 11 years at Vanderbilt with Blalock before moving to Johns Hopkins. So when Dr. Blalock left Vanderbilt Hospital and moved to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, he brought Vivien Thomas with him because he had become very important to the work that Dr. Blalock was doing. They were a team now. Now, let's keep in mind, Dr. Blalock was a certified surgeon. He was trained, and Vivien Thomas was not. He was self-trained, but he was brilliant. He also had a strong work ethic, and he learned outside the lab. He checked out books and read about procedures. He taught himself things that he would have learned in college or med school if he had gone. And their hard work was really paying off on a national and international scene. By 1940, the work Dr. Blalock and Vivien Thomas had done placed Vivien and Dr. Blalock at the forefront of American surgery. Now that is a big deal. And when Dr. Blalock was offered the position of chief of surgery at his alma mater, Johns Hopkins, in 1941, he requested that Thomas accompany him. So see, Dr. Blalock wasn't going to make a move without Vivien Thomas, because not only could Vivien Thomas get along with him, but he was also brilliant too in his own right. Now this was the 1940s, so the country was very segregated. Vivien Thomas received racism in Nashville, as you would expect. But when he moved to Baltimore, which is where Johns Hopkins is located, he says that he received worse racism than what he had experienced in Nashville. He also states that when he walked down the halls of Johns Hopkins Hospital, that people just stared at him because he had on his lab coat, and they weren't used to a black man walking down the hall in a lab coat. So he said that when he would leave the lab, he would put on his street coat so people wouldn't stare at him. Nevertheless, he had made himself invaluable to a very important surgeon who was doing very important work. And it was at Johns Hopkins that they would receive their greatest acclaim. Interestingly enough, other doctors at that hospital knew about Vivien Thomas's work. And although some of them scoffed at him because he was not college educated, and also probably because he was black, still, what really matters is results. And he got the results. So in 1943, while he was working on the shock research, he was approached by a pediatric cardiologist who was trying to come up with a surgical solution to blue baby syndrome. There is a scientific name for it, but I am not going to attempt it. Dr. Blalock and Vivien Thomas realized that the answer to the blue baby syndrome was in a procedure that they had perfected years ago at Vanderbilt. So Vivien Thomas was charged with the task of first creating a blue baby-like condition in a dog, and then correcting the condition by the procedure that he had developed, because I'm not going to try to go through those scientific terms. But he perfected that surgery on the dog of how to increase oxygen flow to the blood. So in 2 years, with him operating on 200 dogs, he got it right. So he did so many of these surgeries successfully on the dogs that he convinced Dr. Blalock that Dr. Blalock could successfully perform that surgery on humans. Now this surgery, the technology behind this surgery was so new that they didn't even have the instruments to use to operate on these children. So Vivien Thomas had to go back and take the needles and clamps that he had used to operate on the animals and adapt them for operating on those human babies. So that's another stroke of genius for Vivien Thomas. When Dr. Blalock attempted this first surgery, because remember, Vivien Thomas couldn't do the surgery on the human because he was not certified. So during the surgery of correcting this blue baby syndrome, at Dr. Blalock's request, Vivien Thomas stood on a step stool at Dr. Blalock's shoulder and coached him step by step through the procedure. Can you imagine that? A black man coaching a white doctor through a procedure that the black man developed. The first surgery was not completely successful, but it did prolong the child's life by a few months. Blalock and his team operated again on an 11-year-old girl, this time with complete success. Vivien Thomas's surgical techniques included one he developed in 1946 for improving circulation in patients whose heart vessels had transposed, which means that their heart vessels had changed places with each other. And he came up with a procedure to correct that. So, sounds like a genius to me. So Vivien Thomas, the grandson of a slave who had no more than a high school education, ended up teaching doctors who would become renowned surgeons, not only in the United States, but in the world. He became a professor of surgery. I mean, that is so amazing to me. And he was respected in that field. Now, it took a while because at first, Dr. Blalock was not going to give him credit for what he had done, even though they had worked together and he had depended on Vivien Thomas. And Dr. Blalock was difficult to work with. There were times when he would lose his temper, according to the biography. There were times when he would lose his temper and use profanity, and this often bothered Vivien Thomas and threatened their stable working relationship. So, because nobody wants to be around somebody that's angry and cussing. Vivien Thomas worked with Dr. Alfred Blalock for 34 years, and it is hinted that Dr. Blalock was a white man in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. So they say his approach to race was complicated and contradictory, which means he was a racist. That's how I read that. And not only that, throughout that 34-year relationship, Vivien Thomas, who was a hard-working laboratory technician, was only paid a janitorial salary. They never want to pay black people the fair salary. So Dr. Blalock recognized the importance of Vivien Thomas in his laboratory work, but he didn't recognize him outside of the job. In other words, he didn't want to have a drink with him after work or go to lunch with him or dinner with him. Also, Dr. Blalock did not want to originally give Vivien Thomas credit for his work in that blue baby surgery. But the truth has a way of coming out, and the truth came out. In 1968, the students that he had taught commissioned this portrait of Dr. Vivien Thomas and had it hung beside Dr. Blalock in the science building that was named for Alfred Blalock. And in 1976, he received an honorary doctorate degree from Johns Hopkins University. And that is why we call him Dr. Thomas. And this is his family. He had a beautiful family. And he was a very focused family man and a very focused businessman. He is a credit to the African American family. Okay, y'all, let me know what you think about the video. Subscribe to the channel, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, share the video. And as always, have a great day.